Hey there. Tonight, we're going to slip into the forgotten corners of medieval life, far from knights and castles, into the cold, cramped homes of peasants who faced winter not with courage, but with quiet desperation. No central heating, no glass windows, no warm blankets, just stone, smoke, and skin pressed against skin. We'll explore how ordinary people made it through the longest, darkest nights when firewood was precious, food was sparse, and the cold crept in like a silent thief. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself sink into a world built on endurance. The walls were never truly walls, not in the way we understand them today. They were thick, yes, made from roughly hewn stone and hardened earth, but they were far from solid. Cold air slipped through the gaps where the mortar had crumbled away, where the wind found tiny faults in the stonework and pressed its way inside. In summer, the draft might have felt like a breeze. In winter, it was a threat. Each evening, as the sun dropped below the horizon, the house began to change. The stones that had held a bit of warmth through the daylight now turned to ice, radiating chill instead of comfort. Touching the wall was like placing a palm against the inside of a grave. The wooden beams that supported the roof creaked in protest as frost bit into their grain, and the cracks between planks widened just enough to let winter whisper through them. Peasants stuffed rags into those cracks, if they had any to spare. Mud and straw, too, were pressed into crevices where the wind liked to gather. But nothing held for long. Water froze and expanded, pushing filler back out again. The cold always came back, always found a way. Entire families could spend hours each evening simply preparing the house for nightfall, shoving dried moss into window frames, stacking loose rocks back into the wall where a corner had weakened, hammering pegs into rotting wood to hold up sagging shutters. But no matter how thorough they were, by midnight, the air inside would feel like the outside. Their efforts didn't keep the cold out. They only delayed it. The stone was indifferent. The wood, dry and cracked, had long ago given up resisting. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with reeds or rushes, but never enough to stop the chill from seeping up through bare feet. Some tried laying planks down, but unless they had the luxury of a second structure to scavenge from, wood was too valuable to waste underfoot. Moisture clung to everything. Even in the deepest parts of the house, the wind could curl in like smoke, ghosting across the floor and circling the ankles of those inside. The smoke hole above the fire was a necessary evil. It let out the worst of the soot, but it also let in the cold. The roof itself, wooden, thatched, and patched with anything that came to hand, offered little insulation. Snow piled atop it, pressing down with its silence, and if it began to melt, water would leak through, dripping steadily through the night onto whatever lay beneath. And so the house was not a shelter so much as a slowed-down version of the outdoors. It was better than nothing, barely. There were no warm rooms, no places one could retreat to escape the worst of the chill. The entire home, often just one room, was a battleground where cold pushed in from every direction. Every night, the air grew heavier, stiller, sharper. Breath turned visible, hanging like ghosts in the dimness. Children burrowed deeper into the straw. Mothers held infants close enough to feel their small ribs rise and fall. Fathers leaned against cold stone and felt it pressing back through their skin. They did not ask if it would be warmer tomorrow. They had long ago stopped expecting change. The house held. That was enough. Not warmth, just the absence of collapse. And that had to be called survival. The fire was never optional. Without it, there was no chance of making it through the night. The cold in a medieval peasant's home wasn't something that could be ignored or endured. It had to be actively fought, and the only weapon they had was flame. But flame came with a cost. The hearth was the heart of the house, but it was also its most dangerous part. Peasants burned whatever they could find: damp wood, animal dung, dried stalks, straw twisted into rough cords. The smoke from that fuel didn't rise cleanly. It poured out, thick and choking, filling the single room until it seemed the house was on fire from the inside out. There was no chimney. If you were lucky, there was a small hole in the roof meant to let the smoke out, but it rarely worked well. More often, the smoke settled and hovered just above the ground before slowly creeping upward, curling around bodies, eyes, and lungs. Eyes burned. Children cried in their sleep, coughing through fits they didn't understand. The air was sharp, not just with cold, but with soot. The walls turned black. The ceiling dripped with tar that oozed from months, years of smoke clinging to its rafters. In winter, people huddled close to the fire, not because they wanted warmth, but because that's where the smoke was thinnest. Further out, it settled like a low fog, waiting. The older generation had learned to live in it. They blinked more slowly, spoke in shorter bursts, coughed quietly and constantly. Visitors to such homes, if they ever came, would last only minutes before needing to step outside to breathe. But for the family that lived there was nowhere to go. Their lungs bore the cost of every night that fire was kept burning. The alternative was frostbite, stiff limbs, and death. They chose smoke. Some tried to improve things. They built crude hoods over the fire pit, angled planks that might guide the smoke toward the exit hole. They hung wet cloths in the air, hoping to trap the soot. They even set bowls of water beneath the smoke's path, believing it might settle into the liquid instead of their lungs. None of it worked well. The fire, fed by whatever was available, burned dirty. The more it was fed, the worse it smoked. And when it died down to embers, the room grew colder by the second. There was no middle ground. Too much fire and they choked. Too little and they froze. So every family made compromises. Some would let the fire rage for a few hours in the evening, then sleep in the afterglow, wrapped in clothes and straw, waking up with raw throats and black snot. Others kept a low flame through the night, stoking it hourly, never sleeping fully, trading rest for air. The children adapted in strange ways. They learned to sleep face down, to bury their noses in fabric or against another person's back where the smoke was less dense. They learned to breathe shallowly, to ignore the sting. No one questioned the arrangement. No one asked why the very thing that gave them life also seemed to be killing them slowly. The cold outside didn't allow room for philosophy. You built a fire. You endured the smoke. And you prayed that the wind outside wouldn't shift and blow down through the roof hole, forcing even more soot back into your home. If that happened, there was nothing to do but wait it out. Coughing, squinting, holding infants close and muttering short prayers between wheezing breaths. The blackened walls weren't shameful. They were a record. Layer upon layer of nights survived through the only means available. And each new smudge was proof that they were still alive. Straw was everywhere, and yet never quite enough. It wasn't chosen for comfort. It was chosen because there was nothing cheaper, nothing more disposable, and nothing more readily available after harvest time. Long after the grains had been threshed and carried off, the hollow stems were gathered in rough bundles, stuffed into sacks, and hauled home. There, they became everything: bedding, insulation, stuffing for cracks in the wall, kindling when no wood could be spared. But above all, straw was warmth, not the kind that wrapped around you like a cloak or radiated like a fire. It was a different kind of warmth, thin, dry, and restless. It scratched the skin, worked its way into shirts and under tunics, and never stopped itching. But it held pockets of air. And in a room where breath turned to mist and fingers stiffened by the hour, those small pockets of trapped warmth were something to cling to. They slept on straw because the earth was too hard and too cold, and they covered themselves with it because they had nothing else. Fabric was precious. A single rough wool blanket might be shared between 5 people. The rest made do with handfuls of straw, scooped and pressed against the body like a nest. At night, entire families would gather around the hearth and dig themselves into straw piles, some laying in rows, others curled into tight balls, children tucked into the middle where the heat might last longer. It was a system that didn't quite work, but was better than nothing. The straw rustled with every shift. It carried the smell of the fields, the dust of old grain, the faint rot of dampness. Sometimes it carried worse: mites, fleas, or the first signs of mold. No one complained. Complaints didn't change anything. You sneezed and scratched and burrowed deeper. Each morning began with shaking the straw loose. It clung to clothes and hair, got into mouths and noses, and left behind a thin coat of dust on everything. People coughed it out of their lungs, wiped it from their eyelids, and swept it back into the pile for reuse. They didn't throw it away until it collapsed entirely, until the stems broke and flattened and no longer held any loft. Only then would they ask a neighbor for more, or go scavenging on the edges of fields, hoping to find what others had missed. In especially harsh winters, straw became a currency. A dry sack could be traded for a chunk of bread or a few hours' labor. Families argued about how much to burn and how much to keep for sleeping. A bad decision meant a warmer fire tonight and frozen limbs tomorrow. The balance was delicate, and the margin for error was thin. And yet, there was something oddly human in the way they arranged it. Even in discomfort, there were habits, rituals almost. Mothers brushing straw from their children's faces before tucking it gently around their necks. Old men muttering to themselves as they fluffed the bedding just so, chasing the illusion of softness. It wasn't comfort, but it was familiarity. The straw bed was never clean, never soft, never silent, but it was home. It creaked and shifted with every breath and gave off the scent of a season long gone. In the dead of winter, when snow pressed against the walls and firewood ran low, they curled into that straw like animals, not out of defeat, but survival. It wasn't a blanket. It wasn't a bed. But it was the only thing that stood between their bodies and the full, bitter reach of the cold, and that made it sacred. Sleep in a medieval peasant household was rarely something everyone did at once. There simply wasn't enough warmth to go around. The fire in the hearth, even when burning well, could not reach the corners of the room. The straw beds grew cold quickly. Blankets were scarce and bodies lost heat fast when left unattended. So families developed their own rhythm, sleeping in shifts, passing warmth like a breath from one body to the next. It wasn't a formal system, not marked by the ringing of bells or the turning of an hourglass. It happened because necessity demanded it. While some slept, others sat near the fire, feeding it cautiously with twigs, bark, or dried manure. They stirred the embers, checked the children, and kept watch for the sounds of wolves outside or the groaning of the roof under snow. After a while, one set of bodies would rise, groggy, stiff, and half-frozen, and the others would take their place. This rotation continued through the night. Parents learned to rest in parts, shoulders slumped against the wall while one hand reached out to the fire. Children dozed in fits and starts, warming one side of their body before turning like bread on a spit to warm the other. The sick or elderly were allowed the longest rests, usually placed closest to the hearth, but even they knew better than to expect peace. If someone began to cough or cry or shiver too hard, a new arrangement was made. Bodies shifted again. Warm spots were offered up. No one was truly asleep in the way modern people understand it. The line between rest and waking was thin and often crossed without notice. A nudge, a whisper, or just the changing pressure of someone lying down beside you could rouse you fully. There was no privacy in a single-room home. Sleep was public, communal, and strategic. Those who were awake passed the time quietly. Loud voices were discouraged. Sound seemed sharper in the cold, more intrusive. Instead, they whispered. Sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they hummed to themselves. And sometimes they simply stared at the fire, watching the slow collapse of wood into ash. There was work to be done even then, mending socks by dim firelight, stirring the last of the stew so it wouldn't freeze solid, reshaping a crumbling wall of straw. In households with livestock inside, someone had to listen for movement. Cows shifting uneasily, chickens fluttering, a goat trying to gnaw through a rope. These were not peaceful hours. They were vigilant ones. The person awake bore the responsibility of guarding not just the fire but the entire family's survival. If the fire died, it would take precious time to bring it back. If a blanket slipped off a child, the chill could settle in their chest. If the wind picked up, someone had to rise and check the door's bar before it blew wide open. Yet there was comfort in this rotation too. Knowing someone was always there, half awake, half alert, was its own kind of security. They didn't think of it as sacrifice. They didn't call it duty. It was just the way things were. And when dawn finally hinted at the edge of the black sky, when frost clung to every surface and the hearth was down to glowing bones, the last to rise were the ones who had kept watch through the deepest dark. They stretched, shook the cold from their joints, and passed on the heat of their seat to the next person. It was not a perfect system. People still fell ill, children still cried themselves hoarse. But more often than not, someone made it to morning, because someone else stayed awake. And that quiet rotation, unnoticed, uncelebrated, was the only reason a cold night didn't become the final one. There was no shame in closeness, not in the depth of winter. When the wind howled through the cracks in the walls and the fire sputtered low, there was only one rule that mattered: stay warm or don't wake up. So people pressed against one another, not out of love, not for comfort, but to keep the blood moving. Entire families curled together on straw beds like a pile of sleeping animals, limbs tangled, backs aligned, breaths shared beneath threadbare blankets. Children were placed in the center, shielded by the heat of their parents' bodies. Elderly relatives were nestled into corners where warmth pooled slightly longer. Siblings lay side by side, feet under each other's legs, arms tucked wherever space allowed. Even those who argued by day would find themselves chest to chest by night, not because they forgave each other, but because survival left no room for distance. The air between bodies was warmer than the air in the room. Skin to skin was best, though rarely spoken aloud. Many slept fully clothed, not just because of modesty, but because removing layers in such temperatures was unthinkable. Still, there were moments when two sets of hands found each other in the dark, when a cheek pressed against a shoulder, when someone reached blindly and found another's breath warming their face. There was no ceremony, no affection. It was a transaction of heat, as vital as food. Movement was kept to a minimum. Shifting too much could let cold air in, could steal away the fragile warmth built up over hours. So they learned to lie still, to breathe in unison, to sleep not as individuals but as a single body wrapped in its own crude insulation. The boundaries between self and other dissolved sometime after midnight, lost beneath the rustle of straw and the rasp of shallow sleep. Sometimes strangers shared space. A visiting laborer, a displaced widow, a child from another family taken in for the season. They all found their place in the pile. There was no time to ask whether it felt appropriate. Warmth was the only permission needed. Even livestock, when allowed inside, became part of this strange lattice of survival. Dogs curled at feet, goats pressed against legs, hens nestled near hips. Their body heat counted too. In some homes, sleeping arrangements were rotated based on who needed warmth most. The sick, the newborn, the weakest. Each was pulled deeper into the center. Stronger bodies took the outside, acting as a living wall against the cold. The ones closest to the edge often woke up with numb fingers and aching joints, but they woke up. That alone was worth the price. No one expected comfort. They expected to last the night. And in the morning, when the fire was reignited and someone began moving again, the pile unraveled slowly, like thawing roots. Stiff bodies separated with quiet grunts, arms stretching toward the warmth of the rekindled hearth. No one spoke of the night's intimacy. There was nothing to say. It wasn't tenderness that had passed between them. It was necessity. But something lingered in that forced closeness, a memory etched into the skin by hours of shared breath and mutual silence. It was not love, not friendship, but something older and colder, the deep, wordless pact of those who had survived the same darkness, shoulder to shoulder. And when night came again, and the fire began its nightly struggle against the wind, they would gather once more, not to bond, not to rest, but to endure. Together, pressed close, because the cold didn't care about boundaries, and neither could they. They wore everything they owned, and even that was barely enough. When winter tightened its grip, peasants layered every scrap of fabric they could find. Tunics over shirts, aprons over tunics, cloaks riddled with holes but still capable of holding in some warmth. The poorest had little more than rough wool or linen, sometimes so threadbare it barely counted as fabric anymore. Rips were sewn shut with thick, crude stitches. Patches covered patches until the original cloth was barely visible. Every layer had a memory, and every memory was worn thin. But nothing was thrown away. Old garments became inner linings. Broken belts were tied around waists, not for shape, but to press the rags tighter against the skin. And dirt, clinging, embedded, stubborn, wasn't an enemy in winter. It acted like another layer. Not clean, not healthy, but insulating. The filth became part of the clothing itself, pressed into the seams, woven into the fibers by sweat, smoke, and time. Bathing was out of the question. Water was too cold, too scarce. And even if it were available, stripping naked in the heart of winter is a risk few were willing to take. The same shirt might be worn for months without removal. Underlayers became stiff with grime, the armpits dark with old sweat, the hems crusted with mud. The stench was heavy but familiar. It clung to everything, the bedding, the straw, the very air. But no one noticed. Not really. When everyone smelled the same, smell ceased to matter. What mattered was how well the fabric held heat. Old wool, greasy with lanolin and dirt, did better than freshly cleaned cloth. Linen shirts, once white, turned a permanent brown-gray from smoke and skin and time. Washing meant softness, yes, but also vulnerability. Soft cloth wore down faster. Dirt toughened it. No one said it aloud, but they all understood it. Cleanliness was for spring. The children disappeared under these layers. A child ready for bed in winter looked like a bundle of old sacks with a red nose sticking out. Mothers wrapped them tightly, sometimes binding the layers with twine or strips of cloth torn from even older garments. Sleeves were tucked into trousers, shirts into socks. Gloves were rare, so hands were pulled inside sleeves or wrapped in bits of fur, if any remained from slaughter season. The goal was simple: keep air from finding a way in. Movement became clumsy. People waddled rather than walked, stiff with the weight of clothing that had grown damp, heavy, and foul. But they moved, and that was all that counted. At night, those layers weren't removed. They were slept in, sweated in, coughed in. They became second skin. And in some cruel way, they worked. The warmth didn't come from the fabric itself. It came from the body beneath it, and the clothing simply slowed its escape. There was something deeply human in the ritual of dressing for the cold. It was not about appearance, not about vanity, but about survival. Each layer told a story of past winters, of relatives long gone, of bargains made and debts unpaid. That cloak with the ripped collar once belonged to a father. The patched tunic had seen 3 children wear through its elbows. Even the stiff wool wrappings on the feet were cut from an old funeral shroud no one had dared to burn. These were not garments. They were inheritance. They were armor. And in the coldest nights, when the fire had gone low and the wind pressed in from all sides, those layers, filthy, heavy, and stiff, were the only thing standing between a living body and the slow, patient fingers of the frost. Dirt, in this world, was not failure. It was proof that you had lasted another day. And that was everything. The pot in the center of the home was more than a tool. It was a lifeline, hung above the fire or balanced precariously on stones. Blackened by years of soot and scorched food, it served as the beating heart of the household. It held the only hot thing many would feel all day. Into it went whatever could be gathered: roots, stale grains, bits of salted meat if there were any, and water scooped from barrels half frozen overnight. But once the stew or broth or porridge was done, the pot didn't return to silence. It remained there, radiating its faint warmth outward, and everyone knew exactly where to go. People didn't gather around the fire. They gathered around the pot. The children sat closest, wide-eyed and silent, not just for hunger, but for the sensation of something warm within arm's reach. Adults crouched behind them, not speaking, just feeling the faint heat on their knees and hands. It was more than body heat they were after. The iron of the pot retained warmth long after the fire beneath it had died down. If you wrapped your hands around its sides, carefully, never too long. You could feel the heat sink into your fingers, travel down your arms like memory. Some rested their foreheads on the side of the pot, eyes closed, just to escape the ache in their skulls from the cold. Others leaned their backs against it, letting the heat seep through their rags and into their bones. It wasn't much, but it was real. And unlike the fire, the pot didn't spit sparks or puff smoke into your eyes. It stayed quiet and solid. And in a home where comfort was a fantasy, that kind of stillness felt like mercy. Even the elderly, too frail to tend to the fire or go out for kindling, would inch themselves toward it, hands trembling, bodies curling into its warmth like moths. Sometimes it served as a pillow. Not directly. No one was foolish enough to press their head against the iron. But a folded cloth or sack placed beside the pot became the most desirable sleeping spot in the house. Those closest to it got the longest sleep, the deepest rest, the slowest chill. There were unspoken rules about who got to sit there. The sick, of course, the youngest children, a mother nursing a baby. In some homes, the place beside the pot rotated like sleeping shifts, each person taking their turn for a brief reprieve from the cold that pressed in on all other sides. Arguments over it were rare, not because people were kind, but because they were tired. The pot gave what it could, and people respected that. They didn't beg it for more. They simply hovered near it, breathing in its steam, listening to the creak of its metal, and hoping it would hold its warmth just a little longer. At night, when the fire had died and only embers remained, the pot was often left full of water or thin gruel. The residual heat kept the contents from freezing solid, and in the early hours, before the sun returned, someone would stir the pot back to life, adding another root, another handful of oats, another scrap of meat if they had it. This act wasn't just cooking. It was survival, warmth from the inside out. A hot spoonful eaten in the darkness could feel like salvation. And then the cycle would begin again. The pot simmered, people gathered, warmth spread. There were no tables, no bowls for each person, no measured servings, just hands, spoons, cloth-wrapped fingers, and mouths pressed close to the rim. And once again, when the food was gone, the pot remained, radiating what little it could, offering its heat to anyone willing to stay close. It was never enough, but it was everything they had. Windows, if they could even be called that, were never made to keep out the cold. In most peasant homes, a window was a hole in the wall, sometimes framed crudely with wood, and more often just an opening left behind during construction. Glass was unheard of. Oiled parchment was rare and fragile, so the wind came and went as it pleased, slipping through the gaps around the boards, moaning through every crack like a living thing. In summer, the opening let in light and breeze. In winter, it became a mouth that swallowed warmth. And so, when the frost came, people stuffed their windows, first with old cloth, then with straw, and when there was nothing else, with clumps of dung. Anything that could stop the draft, even for a moment, became valuable. Rags were pressed deep into corners with sticks. Moss was crammed into crevices with frozen fingers. There was no shame in it. There was only need. Every day, the work had to be redone. Overnight, the wind would push the stuffing loose, or the damp would make it sag and fall away. Rats might chew it. Children might pull it loose out of boredom or restlessness. And so each evening, before the fire was stoked, someone went to the wall to fix the window. It wasn't a window anymore, of course. It was just a patched wound in a house barely holding itself together. The rags used were never clean. They were scraps of worn-out shirts, pieces of apron, corners of blankets that had frayed beyond use. Some were stiff with grease or soot. Others still smelled of mold or livestock. But when balled up and shoved tightly into the cracks, they slowed the cold. Not stopped it, never that, but slowed it enough to matter. Just enough so a mother could nurse a child without his lips turning blue before he finished. Dung was more effective, though few liked to admit it. When dried and packed tight, it formed a dense, crumbly seal that resisted wind far better than cloth ever could. Cow dung was preferred for its volume, but in its absence, anything would do. It was mixed sometimes with mud or straw, formed into clumps, and mashed directly into the holes in the wall or the edges of the window frame. It hardened quickly in the cold and stayed in place longer than fabric. The smell lingered, yes, but they were already living in smoke and filth. One more scent didn't register. Besides, the warmth it preserved far outweighed the discomfort. Children learned to collect it without complaint, gathering dried patties from the edges of fields and carrying them home in baskets like firewood. The house smelled like what it was, a body trying not to die. And that smell came from everything they used to keep it breathing. Sometimes the stuffing fell out during the night, torn loose by a gust or clawed aside by a desperate rodent. And then the cold returned like a beast through an open door. A single exposed gap could drop the room's temperature enough to wake everyone. The fire flared higher as someone fumbled for more rags, more moss, more anything to jam into the space. Fingers bled from scraping stone and frozen wood. The cloths became frozen themselves, stiff and useless. But they kept trying. Every morning the window was checked. Every night it was sealed again. It was a ritual, one as vital as eating. There were no curtains. There was no glass. There was only what you could gather with your hands and press into the wound. And when it held, even for a few hours, the room felt. When winter descended with its full weight, the walls between human and animal dissolved. Livestock, normally kept in crude pens or thatched sheds nearby, were brought inside, not for their safety, but for their heat. A cow could warm a room like a small fire. A goat, curled in a corner, could raise the temperature just enough to stave off frostbite. Chickens huddled near the hearth provided not only eggs, but warmth in the dark hours before dawn. These animals weren't guests. They were survival tools. Their bodies gave off heat. Their breath filled the room with moisture. And their closeness meant the difference between waking up with stiff joints and not waking up at all. People didn't think twice about the smell or the noise. It was simply part of winter life. The house stank of dung and smoke and wet fur, but at least it wasn't quiet. Quiet meant cold. Quiet meant something had died. The layout of a peasant home changed in winter. What little floor space existed was divided strategically. One corner was for sleeping, another for cooking, and one, usually near the door, was cleared for the animals. There was no fence or barrier. Maybe a rope to keep the cow from wandering, or a basket to stop the chickens from roosting in the bedding, but nothing more. Children shared their sleep with hooves and tails. A piglet might root under a blanket. A sheep might lay down beside an old man's legs. It was chaotic, often filthy, sometimes dangerous, but it worked. The animals slept better too, protected from the wind and snow. Their manure steamed gently in the straw, warming the floor beneath it. No part of the animal went unused, not in life, not in death, and not even in the idle hours between. There were risks, of course. Animals stepped on hands. They kicked in their sleep. Chickens fluttered onto beds and left droppings without pause. A sick animal might cough through the night, spreading disease. Lice passed freely from fur to hair, but none of that outweighed the benefit of their warmth. Their presence turned the room into something vaguely alive, a shared furnace of flesh and breath and friction. On the worst nights, when the wind moaned through the shutters and the fire struggled to stay lit, people would press their backs against a cow's side or tuck their hands beneath a goat's belly. They didn't ask permission. They didn't need to. The animals were too tired to care. The heat radiated through rags and cloaks deep into the skin. For a few precious hours, the cold couldn't reach them. And in a world where nothing was ever really warm, that counted for more than anything. By morning, the house was a mess. Trampled straw, clumps of manure, feathers drifting in the air. The smell was stronger, the air heavier, the floor slick in places. But everyone had made it through the night. That was what mattered. After the animals were led back out to whatever shelter waited for them, the home was swept in silence. The filth was tolerated because it had kept the children alive, because it had softened the edge of the frost just enough to survive. No one spoke of gratitude. No one looked the animals in the eye as they left. But when the next night fell, the doors would open again, the rope would be tied, and the bodies, human and animal, would settle into their shared rhythm. It was not warmth. It was not peace, but it was life. And in the coldest weeks of the year, that was more than enough. At night, stepping outside was not a choice. It was a gamble. The cold wasn't just discomfort. It was danger. A moment of exposure could turn into a sickness that lingered for weeks, or worse, never left at all. Feet froze in seconds, and fingers went numb before the latch on the door could even be lifted. For those living in cramped, single-room cottages, the idea of going out to relieve oneself during the deep hours of the night was absurd. The wind howled beyond the walls, snow piled high against the threshold, and the darkness beyond the door was total. Even if you could make it to the latrine, assuming one existed, you wouldn't come back the same. Some didn't come back at all. So the solution was simple, if undignified. They used buckets. Every family had one, tucked beneath the bed or placed behind the door, wrapped in cloth or straw to muffle the sound. The piss bucket was not a luxury. It was as essential as the fire, as the straw bed, as the patched-up window. Its presence meant that the family could remain huddled together through the coldest hours without losing precious heat or endangering themselves. There were no chamber pots of polished brass, no lids or handles or elegance. These were rough wooden pails, sometimes lined with old cloth to soak up the worst of it, sometimes just crude containers that reeked by morning. The smell mingled with smoke and dung and unwashed bodies. One more note in the thick, sour air of winter. But no one complained. They couldn't afford to. Complaints didn't warm you. The bucket was shared. Men, women, children. No one was spared the awkward shuffle toward it in the dark, the lifting of layers, the hiss of urine on wood or cloth or dirt. Privacy was a fiction. Survival didn't allow for modesty. By morning, the bucket would be full. It had to be emptied carefully, usually by the strongest or youngest, someone nimble enough to navigate the icy steps without spilling. The contents were poured into a trench, or behind the barn, or onto the compost pile if there was one. Sometimes it froze before it hit the ground. The task was thankless. No one wanted it, but someone always did it. Because if the bucket wasn't emptied, the stink would become unbearable. Worse, it could spill. And that kind of mess, in a room where people slept on the floor and ate with their hands, could lead to sickness. So even in the deep cold, with stiff joints and aching muscles, someone would pull on their layers, lift the bucket with both hands, and step out into the biting air. They didn't linger. They didn't breathe too deeply. They just got it done. There was no conversation about it. Children learned the routine without needing to be told. When to use it. How to do so without waking the others. How to hold the sides to keep it from tipping. It was part of winter life, like coughing or layering rags or pressing against a sibling for warmth. It wasn't spoken of, but it was understood. Everyone did it. Everyone knew. And in that small, silent act, half asleep, squatting in a corner while the wind pressed against the walls, there was something raw and real about what it meant to survive the medieval cold. Not with honor, not with grace, but with buckets and blankets and grit. You didn't outsmart the winter. You didn't fight it head on. You avoided its teeth, you bent around it, and you found warmth in the simplest, most human solutions, even when they stank. Especially when they stank. Because the body didn't care about dignity when the cold was trying to take it. It only cared about waking up alive. By the time the first light crept through the rag-stuffed cracks in the wall, the frost had already claimed the room. Not the fields outside, not the trees or the paths or the barn, but the inside. The walls glistened faintly in the half-darkness, a thin layer of ice forming where the breath of the sleepers had met the frozen stone and stayed. It wasn't rare. It wasn't even surprising. It was simply how mornings began during the hardest weeks of winter. The moisture in the air, exhaled in sleep, released by simmering pots, rising from damp clothes, had nowhere to go. It clung to the coldest surfaces and froze there, quietly and invisibly, until dawn revealed it like some delicate, spiteful lace. The interior of the home turned to frostwork. The ceiling beams wore white coats. The straw underfoot felt stiff and cold. Even the corners of blankets, left hanging too close to the wall, crackled when touched. The windows, if there were any, were opaque with frost inside and out. Children woke with eyebrows crusted in tiny ice crystals, hair stuck to the inside of hoods and scarves, damp from breath and frozen stiff. Fingers, if left uncovered, curled slowly in pain until warmed again near the embers. The cold came from everywhere, but it lived deepest in the places they trusted. Inside the room, inside the bedding, sometimes even inside the clothes. A metal cup left too close to the wall might have a rim of ice. A ladle in the cooking pot, forgotten overnight, might be locked in place by the skin of frozen broth. And yet, no one remarked on it. It was not a shock. It was a season. The house froze with them. They rose and lived in it anyway, crunching through the straw, wiping frost from the lips of jugs, brushing a thin shimmer of ice off the sleeping baby's face before feeding him. Sometimes the frost was beautiful. Delicate swirls along the wooden beams, thin white feathers creeping up the sides of clay jugs. It looked like art. It looked like some careful hand had drawn it there in silence. But no one admired it. The beauty of it came from death. The colder the room, the more ornate the frost, the more suffering it had soaked in. Those patterns meant the fire had burned too low, that someone hadn't risen in time to stoke it, that the rags in the windows had shifted, or the wind had changed direction. Frost was failure made visible. It didn't come in from the outside. It grew from within, like mold. It marked the places where warmth had given up. No one smiled at it. They scraped it away with sleeves, wiped it off wooden handles, and held their breath when lifting sleeping children in case their skin had frozen to the wall. That happened sometimes, especially with infants, especially when no one noticed in time. To live inside a house with frozen walls was to live inside something that no longer defended you. The frost didn't rage like wind or burn like snow. It simply waited, and it grew in silence. On their breath, their clothes, their skin, and yet they adapted. They moved slower in the mornings. They avoided the darkest corners. They learned which part of the bed to keep their hands from touching. They didn't weep or curse or even really fear it anymore. The cold had become a neighbor, unwelcome but tolerated, pressing closer each day, slipping into their space like another mouth to feed. When the fire finally flared again, they would sit beside it, not speaking, letting their limbs thaw and their minds catch up. The frost would melt slowly, drop by drop, soaking into the straw, into the fabric, into the floor. It would vanish by noon, only to return again that night. It always did. Because in that world, the cold was not outside. It was in the walls, in the breath, in the bones. And nothing, not even home, could keep it away. The ceiling was never clean. It began to blacken the moment the first fire was lit beneath it, and it never stopped. Layer after layer of soot accumulated over the seasons, thickening into a greasy, powdery crust that clung to every timber, every rafter, every beam overhead. It darkened the air even when the fire wasn't burning, casting a permanent dusk across the room. But no one ever scraped it off. No one ever tried. The soot was a sign of life, a quiet record of every winter endured, every night when the fire had burned long enough to stain the roof. It meant the hearth had been fed, the smoke had risen, and the heat had stayed. In homes where the ceilings were still pale wood, visitors might exchange glances. Either the fire had been burning too low, or the family had not survived the previous cold well. In contrast, a ceiling caked in soot told its own story. They were still here. The soot did more than stain. It insulated. Not by any deliberate design, but simply by presence. Each layer of blackened residue trapped a little warmth, slowed a little draft, filled the tiny gaps between beams with something thicker than air. It dulled the cold. Not much, but in a world where a single degree could mean the difference between sleep and shivering, even that mattered. Over the years, it hardened in places, flaked in others, drifted down like dirty snow when the wind rattled the structure too hard. It gathered in the corners, turned white shirts gray, settled onto blankets and into hair. The smell of it was everywhere, sharp, oily, clinging to skin and cloth alike. Babies crawled beneath it, unaware that every inch of their world was shadowed by combustion. Their first breath each morning was thick with smoke that had never quite left. Still, no one wiped it away. To clean the ceiling was to erase proof of heat, and the soot reminded them of nights survived. Every meal cooked, every ember fed, every pot hung and stirred and simmered. Each one left a mark overhead. The stains grew heavier in the center of the room, directly above the fire pit, then tapered outward in streaks and smudges. Some beams, closer to the source, were blackened beyond recognition, the grain of the wood completely lost beneath the buildup. These weren't signs of neglect. They were signs of endurance. In some homes, fingers had traced initials or symbols into the soot, not out of playfulness, but because there was nowhere else to leave a mark. Walls were damp and crumbling. Ceilings held memory. They were the closest thing to a family archive. A child could look up and see the shape of the room that had kept them warm, the dark pattern that had watched them grow. It was a history book written in ash, but it was not without cost. The soot fell. It got into lungs. It coughed out in black phlegm, coated the inside of mouths, and made throats raw. People hacked through the night, especially in winter, not just from cold, but from what they were breathing. When a flare of wind blew smoke back into the room, the air thickened to the point of blindness. Children's eyes streamed. The elderly wheezed. Yet still the fire was fed. Still the ceiling grew darker, because the alternative, clean air and cold bodies, was worse. They accepted the trade. They lived beneath their soot-covered ceilings as if beneath a low sky, heavy but familiar, oppressive but constant. And every night, when the fire roared to life once more and sent another plume of smoke rising, they didn't flinch. They watched it disappear into the black above, knowing it would stay there, knowing it would add another layer to the shelter that held their warmth in place. Not beautiful, not safe, but theirs. In the deepest part of winter, the inside of the house breathed as heavily as those who lived within it. Not in metaphor, but in fog. With every exhale, each man, woman, and child filled the cramped air with a thin cloud of vapor, hanging like ghosts in the dim light. You didn't need to step outside to see your breath. It hovered right there in front of your face, even beside the fire, even beneath layers of rags. It was a reminder every time of how close the cold had come, how deeply it had settled into the walls, the air, the fabric, the flesh. Talking became something to be done briefly and quietly. The more you spoke, the more you exhaled, and the more the room seemed to fill with steam. In the early mornings, before the fire had been stirred back to life, the house felt submerged in it. Low clouds of breath floating above sleeping figures like offerings from 100 small mouths. Children played with it, sometimes, blowing through pursed lips to make shapes in the cold. But even that was quiet, subdued. The novelty wore off quickly when your lungs burned with each inhale and your nose refused to stay warm, no matter how tightly you wrapped your scarf. The older ones learned to breathe through their sleeves, to trap some of the warmth before it escaped, to keep the moisture from freezing on their faces. Sometimes the vapor condensed on eyelashes, freezing there in tiny crystals. Mustaches stiffened. Hairline curls turned brittle. The act of breathing became physical, visible, present. You saw every breath you took and knew that without it, your warmth would vanish completely. The house itself began to feel alive, the air thick with 1,000 floating sighs, rising slowly, then cooling into stillness. No one wiped it away. It couldn't be. It wasn't condensation on a window or a puddle on the floor. It was air made visible by desperation. At night, the vapor gathered more thickly. With the fire low and the air unmoving, every breath lingered longer than it should. It mixed with smoke and dust, forming a slow-moving haze just above the floor. If someone cried in their sleep, the burst of vapor would rise suddenly, curling away like a frightened animal. If someone laughed, rare, quiet, it showed in a puff, vanishing just as quickly as it came. No emotion stayed long. The cold swallowed everything. The wetness in the air made the blankets feel heavier, the straw slick and dense. And sometimes the room would go entirely quiet, save for the sound of breath, shallow, choked, careful, each one measured. No one wanted to exhale too much. No one wanted to lose what little heat they had. And so the breathing slowed. The room, even with 10 bodies in it, could fall silent except for the fire's crackle and the faint hiss of lungs leaking warmth into the open dark. By morning, the house smelled of stale air and damp cloth. The vapor had settled into everything, turning straw to mush and fabric to sludge. Clothes felt cold and wet before they were even touched. Blankets clung to the skin with a clammy persistence. People woke up coughing, their throats coated in a mixture of soot and ice. The sun, when it finally reached the house, cast long lines through the gaps in the wall, cutting across the lingering mist like beams through fog. There was no clearing it, no opening of windows to let the air freshen. It was too cold for that. The only thing to do was relight the fire, boil water, move slowly, and wait for the next wave of breath to begin the cycle again. And so it went, day after day, breath after breath, visible proof that the house was still alive, that its people had not yet frozen silent. The air was heavy with their survival, and it hung there, one breath at a time. In the long, dark months of winter, nothing in the house was random, not even where a child slept. Every inch of the room was mapped for warmth, and the warmest places didn't belong to the strongest or the oldest. They belonged to the smallest, the softest, the most vulnerable. Children were not just precious, they were fragile, and the cold took them first. So at night, they were placed low to the ground, often directly under the main bed if one existed, or nestled against the stones of the hearth, where the last heat of the fire still lingered. It wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. There, beneath the sagging boards, or beside the glowing embers, their tiny bodies could steal just enough warmth from the world to keep breathing until morning. No mattress waited for them, just straw, rags, old sacks, or the bare floor. But compared to the bitter air that filled the rest of the room, those spaces were almost kind. There was no ceremony in laying them down. After the fire had been tended, the straw shaken out, and the piss bucket placed, the children were bundled in whatever scraps remained and tucked into the dark. Mothers checked their breathing, ran hands over cold cheeks, adjusted hoods and sleeves, and makeshift mittens. Then they were left there, sometimes with a sibling beside them, sometimes alone, while the adults arranged themselves above or around them. The proximity to the hearth or the bed frame offered a kind of insulation. Heat rose but slowly, and the cold that crept across the floor was slightly less cruel near those fixed points. Still, it was a risk. Rats came closer to the fire too. Insects lived in the cracks of the floorboards, and if the fire sparked or the bucket spilled or someone shifted in their sleep, the child would be the first to suffer. But that was the calculation. A greater chance of warmth meant a lesser chance of death. They learned quickly not to cry. Crying meant drawing attention, and attention meant being moved somewhere colder to make room for others. They learned to lie still, to breathe slowly, to keep their hands tucked inside their layers and their feet pressed against the stone or the underside of the bed. In the morning, they would emerge slowly, groggy and stiff, crawling out from the shadows like animals leaving a burrow. hair full of straw, skin blotchy with chill, voices hoarse from the damp air. Some mornings they woke too quiet, too slow. And that was when Mother's hands moved fastest, rubbing limbs, holding breath near noses, checking for signs that life had stayed through the night. Most of the time it had, but not always. The winter took without warning, and when it did, there was no time for grief, not in that moment. The living still needed to be fed. The fire still needed to be lit. The cold did not wait for morning. Still, the children adapted. They grew into the ritual, into the darkness, into the closeness of stone and smoke. They made games of it when they could, whispering beneath the bed, drawing patterns in the soot with their fingers, pretending the floor was a cave and they were foxes or wolves or kings in hiding. Their bodies remembered warmth in ways the adults had forgotten. How to curl tightly, how to pull a blanket over two heads instead of one, how to find the still warm spot left by someone else. It wasn't safety, but it was enough to let them grow, enough to make it to spring. And year after year, those same children who had once slept under the bed would rise and become the ones placing the next generation in the same spot, tucking them near the fire, patting down the straw, whispering, "Stay still, stay warm." Because in a house built not for comfort but for endurance, the warmest place wasn't the softest. It was wherever the smallest body might last the night. The bed was never truly a place of rest. It was a tool, a shared platform of wood or bundled straw, where bodies were stacked not for comfort but for warmth. In a medieval peasant household, one bed often meant space for 5 or 6 people, sometimes more. There were no separate rooms, no privacy, no solitude. Entire families lay side by side, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, in a single lumpy mass of limbs and fabric and fatigue. The idea of personal space did not exist. Blankets, if they had them, were spread over the entire group like a canvas pulled tight over logs. If there weren't enough blankets, bodies became the blanket. The closest ones to the edge froze first, while those trapped in the middle sweated through their rags and dreamed of fresh air. No one moved much, not because they didn't want to, but because there was nowhere to move to. Every inch was claimed by another shivering form. But being close did not mean being comfortable. Sleep was shallow, fragmented, and often impossible. Each shift of a body sent a ripple through the pile, disturbing the fragile equilibrium. One cough echoed, one sneeze startled. A leg draped too heavily over another caused whispered complaints or sharp elbows. Someone would always snore. Someone would always twitch. And someone, eventually, would start to cry in their sleep, quietly, without waking, but loud enough to remind everyone that rest was never guaranteed. The straw poked through the thin padding beneath them, scratching backs and hips, while cold crept up through the floor despite every effort to block it. The fire's glow never reached far enough. The warmth of others dulled the worst of the freeze, but it came with sweat, breath, and stink. Feet tangled, arms lost circulation, backs ached, and still they lay there, eyes open in the dark, waiting for morning. There was no rhythm to the night. People rose and lay down at irregular intervals. Whoever had fire duty would get up. Whoever returned would crawl back in. If livestock stirred, someone had to check. If a child whimpered, someone had to soothe. If the wind picked up, someone had to stuff more rags into the walls. The bed was always shifting, always in flux, Sometimes, those who couldn't sleep simply lay awake, staring up at the soot-blackened ceiling, feeling the heat of the bodies beside them, but feeling no comfort from it. Others drifted in and out of half-sleep, dreams broken by coughing fits or the sudden pressure of someone turning in the dark. No one talked. Voices were saved for daylight. At night, sound was too sharp, too intrusive. Instead, there were groans, sighs, rustlings, the language of exhaustion shared in silence. And even silence, when it came, was heavy with tension. A still bed didn't mean peace. It meant everyone was pretending. When morning finally arrived, the bed broke apart slowly. One by one, people sat up, joints stiff, faces pale, straw clinging to their clothes. There were no stretches, no yawns, no lazy comfort. Just quiet motion, bodies unfolding themselves, blankets peeled back, rags shaken out. The warmth they had shared evaporated quickly, pulled away by the air the moment they left the pile. What little rest they'd found would not last. The fire needed stoking, the pot needed stirring, the cold needed pushing back again. No one spoke of sleep because no one had truly had it. They had lain down together, clung to one another, closed their eyes. That was all. And tonight, they would do it again. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. In a house ruled by frost, sleep was not a gift. It was a battle. And most nights, they simply tried to lose it slower than the cold could win. The prayers were never loud. They were whispered into sleeves, into straw, into the folds of rough blankets pulled up to trembling chins. There was no strength left for chanting, no warmth in the voice to call out with force. In the dead of winter, prayer was something small and private, offered between shivers, between coughs, between the aching of joints and the burning of cold fingers. It wasn't a ritual to be admired. It was something closer to survival. Hands pressed together not just in reverence, but in desperation, to keep them warm, to stop them from shaking. Words slurred and shortened, syllables lost in the chill, repeated more out of habit than hope. And still, every night, in that dim and frozen silence, someone prayed for warmth, for food, for the children to wake up breathing, for the old not to stiffen in the dark, for the walls to hold, for the roof not to crack beneath the weight of snow. There were no candles. They couldn't waste the wax. Most prayers were offered in total darkness, the only light coming from the last sighs of the fire or the faint gray glow of moonlight pressing through rags stuffed in the window. The darkness wasn't symbolic. It was just how things were. No icons hung on the wall. If they had them, they were buried beneath cloth for safekeeping. No crucifixes gleamed in the firelight. There were no choirs, no organs, no Latin chants. Only breath, and the sharp hiss of it freezing in the air. The faith they carried was quiet, buried under layers of soot and silence. It did not promise deliverance. It only gave something to cling to when the blankets failed. The words were passed down more like recipes than hymns, muttered in corners, whispered by mothers to children, shaped by the needs of the house rather than the rules of the church. They asked for endurance, not miracles. Sometimes they prayed while stirring the pot, or while wrapping a child in one more layer of cloth, or while lying awake listening to the scratching of rats. A single line repeated over and over until it became rhythm rather than meaning. Let us see the morning. Let this wood burn long. Let no one be taken tonight. There was no illusion that God would spare them the cold. But maybe, just maybe, he would let them last until spring. That was enough. Religion in winter was not about joy or resurrection. It was about surviving long enough to confess your bitterness in spring. The fear that lived in their bellies was not just fear of death, but fear of being forgotten, of freezing in the night and being found stiff and blue, one of many. Prayers were a way of reminding themselves that they still lived, still spoke, still knew how to ask for help, even if none came. By morning, the prayers stopped. There was too much to do. Ashes to sweep, buckets to empty, bread to break, if there was any left. But sometimes, a line of prayer would hang in the air even after the voices fell silent, echoing in the clatter of wood being fed to flame, or the soft murmur of a child still dreaming. No one gave thanks. They hadn't been saved. They had simply survived again, which was not the same. Still, some would nod once toward the ceiling, or tap their fingers twice against their chest, or mutter a final line under their breath while tying a shawl. It wasn't about faith in divine protection. It was about memory. The memory of cold nights, of words that passed between the living and the dark, and of the shared, trembling silence where prayer lived, thin, cracked, but unbroken, like the people themselves. And so they prayed, because there was nothing else, and because sometimes that was enough. In the depths of winter, water was not a source of life. It was an obstacle. It froze in buckets, in jugs, in wooden troughs left too close to the door. It froze inside the house, under the table, beside the hearth, even in clay pots that had been wrapped in rags and tucked into corners. You could wake in the morning to find the water you meant to cook with now sealed under a thick layer of ice, solid and useless. Breaking it took time. Melting it took fire. And firewood was never plentiful enough to waste on thawing something that would only refreeze within the hour. In some households, water became too precious to be practical. It couldn't be counted on to remain liquid long enough to use. And so they turned to what didn't freeze: ale. Ale was not a luxury. It was a necessity, brewed thick and weak, not for pleasure, but for survival. The alcohol content was low, barely noticeable, but just high enough to keep it from freezing solid in the brutal cold. Barrels of home-brewed ale stood near the hearth, covered with cloth to keep out ash and rats, always slightly warm to the touch from the proximity to the fire. It wasn't clear or clean. It was cloudy, sour, sometimes flat. But it was drinkable. And more importantly, it stayed drinkable when everything else turned to ice. Children drank it, the elderly drank it, the sick drank it. It was safer than water, not because of any myth or superstition, but because it could be relied upon. You could pour a cup at midnight and it would still move in the morning. That alone made it valuable. Warm ale was better than cold ale, if you could manage it. Set near the fire for just a few minutes, it softened on the tongue and eased into the belly like something alive. People passed around the same cup, steaming slightly, breathing in the yeasty comfort of it. It wasn't intoxicating, not the way modern people think of alcohol. It didn't fog the mind. It simply dulled the edge of the cold, added a flicker of heat from the inside out. And in the darkest hours, that mattered. Ale became part of the nightly rhythm, sipped before bed, sometimes even used to rinse a rag for cleaning. or to soften stale bread that had gone hard in the frost. There were no mugs with handles, no toasts, just clay cups, wooden bowls, sometimes hollowed-out horns, and inside them, the one thing that didn't betray them to winter. When spring came, the barrels ran dry. Water flowed again, and people washed more freely, drank from wells, cooked without having to plan every movement around temperature. But for those brutal months, ale was what held them together. Unremarkable, lukewarm, slightly sour, but constant. It carried no joy, only function. And yet, in its way, it was sacred. Because when the water froze in the corners, when the snow pressed hard against the door and the fire cracked low, there was still one liquid that moved, still one thing that could be swallowed without pain, still one warmth they didn't have to fight for. And that was enough. In a world made of ice and ash, the smallest mercy tasted like yeast and wood smoke. And they drank it slowly, carefully, not to savor it, but to make it last just a little longer. The cold didn't just chill, it split things open. The longer the frost held, the more it got into every surface, every edge, every seam. Skin was the first to go, drying out slowly, then suddenly cracking without warning. Lips bled from smiling, from speaking, from nothing at all. They peeled in strips, swollen and raw. Tongues stuck to teeth. The corners of mouths split with the simplest expression, and every exhale left salt on already raw skin. Fingers, red and chapped, became clumsy. The skin around the knuckles opened in pale tears, stinging even without touch. And feet, always the feet, took the worst of it. The soles hardened and cracked, deep and dirty, bleeding into socks and straw. Heels split until walking felt like punishment. And yet they walked anyway, because they had to, because everything else was worse, because sitting still meant the cracks deepened. They tried to stop it. Animal fat rubbed into hands, soot mixed with lard, wax dripped from half-burned candles, all pressed into the skin like balm. But nothing held for long. The air was too dry, the heat too fleeting, the cold too aggressive. At night, under layers of rags and wool, the cracks would stiffen. By morning, they'd broken open again. Children cried when their hands touched snow, not because of the cold, but because of how it seeped into the wounds. Elderly fingers curled inward, not from age, but from pain, and the smell, iron and dirt and rot, clung to every blanket. No one was untouched. Everyone bled, in small ways, quietly, into the world around them. The house soaked it in. The straw turned dark with it. The edges of sleeves stiffened where blood met frost. But it never stopped them. It just became another part of the body's winter. And it wasn't just flesh. The house itself cracked. Wooden boards warped and split from the pressure. The cold made everything shrink, pull away from its joints. A step across the floor that could end with a sharp pop as a plank gave way or snapped in two. Furniture groaned under weight it once carried with ease. The walls, especially near the windows, split along the grain, deep fissures appearing overnight like sudden wounds. The table wobbled. The bed creaked louder than ever. Even the doors refused to close the same way, warped and stiff, sometimes jammed shut until someone leaned their whole body against them. Tools left outside froze and cracked open. Clay pots shattered if filled too full. Everything was breaking. The sound of splintering was constant, almost normal. a kind of background language that told them the cold had gotten in again. Not in a scream, just a slow, quiet tearing. They didn't panic. There was no point. They patched what they could. Strips of cloth over skin, bits of iron across beams, straw pushed into cracks to muffle the wind. They tied boards back together with rope, nailed broken chairs into new shapes. Splinters were pulled from feet. Blood was wiped away. No one asked if the damage was permanent. Of course it was, but permanent didn't mean final. It just meant something new to carry. And so they did. With fingers wrapped in cloth and floors that cracked beneath them, they moved through the house like ghosts made of grit. Everything was breaking, but not all at once. And as long as the cracks stayed small, as long as the blood clotted, as long as the boards held for one more step, they would keep going. The house groaned. The bodies ached. The silence split with every movement, and that was winter. Not a freeze, a slow, steady fracturing, and the stubborn refusal to fall apart completely. The nights were never truly silent. They only pretended to be. Beneath the stillness, beneath the soft crackling of the last coals and the slow rhythm of sleeping breath, there were always sounds, small, sudden, sharp. The creak of wood shifting under the frost, the whisper of wind slipping through the rags in the window, the low groan of the roof under the weight of snow. Each sound, no matter how ordinary, came wrapped in dread. In daylight, they might pass unnoticed, but at night, when the body was stiff with cold and the mind thin with fatigue, every noise felt like a warning. A branch scraping the wall could be a hand. A thud beyond the door might be a wolf or a thief. The house, fragile as it was, felt like a ship adrift in black water. Anything could reach it. Anything could pierce it. And so each creak, each knock, each rustle carried the weight of imagined endings. No one leapt up right away. They lay still at first, listening, measuring, trying to decide if the sound had been real or dream, if it came from inside or out, if it was just the house shifting or something worse. The fire offered no comfort. Its light barely reached past the hearth, and its warmth didn't travel far enough to grant courage. A mother might draw her children closer. A father might grip the handle of a worn knife beneath the blankets. Sometimes a dog would growl low in its throat. Sometimes the livestock stirred. Those were the worst moments, when the animals heard something before the people did. A chicken fluttering in the dark, a goat rising to its feet without cause. The room would hold its breath. Hearts beat louder in the silence, thudding in ears already sharp with fear. Because in winter, sound was a messenger, and the message was rarely good. There were stories, of course, told quietly by the fire when the day had been mild and the spirits high. Stories of men disappearing from their beds after a knock at the door, of wolves clever enough to mimic human cries, of spirits drawn to warmth, pressing their faces to the walls, whispering through the gaps. Most called them nonsense. But still, when a knock echoed unexpectedly, no one moved. When a sound repeated itself, a tap, a scrape, a dragging, they listened harder, just in case. Sometimes the door would shift in its frame, puffing smoke back into the room. Sometimes a board would snap loudly, with no foot upon it. These were natural things, but in the dark, natural became untrustworthy. Familiar things twisted in the cold. And with no way to see, with no one to call for help, the fear settled like a weight on the chest. No one wanted to be the one to rise and check. but someone always had to. When they did, it was slow. Blanket pushed aside. Legs swung out into the freezing dark. Feet slipping into frozen boots or onto damp straw. A candle rarely lit. There was no time. Just a hand on the door latch. Just a breath held in the ribs. And behind them, others lay still, listening for the outcome. Would the door open? Would it stay closed? Would there be shouting? Nothing at all? The seconds stretched long and tight. Most of the time there was nothing. Just the wind, or the snow slipping from the roof, or a rat knocking over a bowl. The person would return, teeth clenched, face unreadable, and lie back down without a word. Relief never came in sighs. It came in silence, in the sound not repeating, in the nothingness that returned. But the fear stayed longer. It had already curled into the straw, into the blankets, into the dreams, and even when sleep finally returned, it was light, broken, full of sounds that never quite faded. Ash was never wasted. After the fire had burned down, after the last warmth had been scraped from the coals and the pot removed from the embers, what remained in the hearth was gathered carefully, not swept away, not discarded, but collected like something valuable. Because in a world where cold came in through every crack and hole, even ash had purpose. It was soft, dry, dense, and surprisingly warm to the touch when fresh. And though it no longer gave heat, it still offered defense. People packed it into the gaps between floorboards, stuffed it into the seams where the walls met the ground, smeared it along ledges where cold air crept in like fingers. Mixed with straw, mud, or dung, it became a crude kind of insulation, an ashen paste that blocked the wind and dulled the draft. There were better materials, of course, but they were rare or expensive. Ash was always there, cheap, abundant, familiar. They didn't speak of it as cleverness. It wasn't innovation. It was repetition. What their parents had done and their parents before them. Each winter reinforced the lesson. When cloth was gone and moss was damp, ash remained. A handful pressed into the edge of a shutter could stop a shiver. A line of it along the sill could slow the frost. It worked best when layered thick, packed deep, almost sculpted into the shape of the space it filled. Children helped. They were sent to scoop it with their hands, blackening their palms and cuffs, returning with wooden bowls full of fine gray dust that billowed at the slightest breath. Sometimes they coughed from it. Sometimes it got into their eyes. But they kept working, because every crevice they sealed made the night a little less cruel. The house grew darker as the ash spread, smudging the edges of the room like a slow-burning shadow, but it also grew quieter. Still, less pierced by wind. Not all ash was the same. The finest came from hardwood, burned long and clean. It was soft as powder, light and dry, ideal for packing. Ash from dung fires was denser, coarser, often sticky or greasy, but it worked just as well. Some families saved ash by type, keeping the cleanest near the bed, the dirtiest for the corners no one touched. In the worst of winter, they mixed it with water and clay to make a sealant, patching up cracks that had widened from frost or strain. It didn't last forever. Each morning, some of it crumbled out. It had to be reapplied, reshaped, replaced. But that was true of everything in the house. Nothing held long. Everything was temporary. Survival was in the maintenance, the repetition, the refusal to let the cold win. And ash, humble and dead though it seemed, was one of the few things that stayed useful long after its fire had gone out. It got into everything, into clothes, into food, into lungs. The smell of it was constant, earthy, bitter, dry. People walked with it on their feet, slept with it in their hair. It dusted the edge of the firewood pile, clung to the rags stuffed in the walls, turned water gray when hands were washed. But no one minded. Ash meant the fire had burned. Ash meant something had once been warm. And more than that, it meant they still had the means to fight the cold. Not with strength or fire or fortune, but with what the fire left behind. In a world where everything was breaking, freezing, thinning out beneath the weight of winter, ash was what remained. Silent, soft, and stubborn. It didn't burn, it didn't shine, but it filled the gaps. And sometimes that was all they needed to make it through one more night. Firewood was the real wealth of winter. Not silver, not land, not grain in the loft, just wood. Dry, seasoned, unrotted wood. Every stick mattered. Every log was counted, handled, examined for softness or dampness or signs of fungus. It didn't take long to learn that no matter how much you thought you had, it was never enough. A small pile that looked promising in October would be a memory by mid-January. The cold didn't care how carefully you rationed. It came anyway, seeping through walls and floors, demanding more heat than you could ever give. So people burned reluctantly. Fires were kept low, never blazing unless absolutely necessary. A single log was expected to smolder for hours, prodded and rearranged to keep it alive as long as possible. Kindling was collected with almost reverent care. Every twig, every scrap of bark, every dry pine cone became precious. Children were sent to scavenge, their hands red and stiff, instructed to bring back anything that might burn, even if it barely burned at all. The rules of firewood were strict and unspoken. No one burned whole logs unless the frost had crept into the beds or someone was ill. Even then, it was done with apology. Green wood was cursed, not just because it smoked, but because it was wasteful. Wet wood hissed and spat and stole warmth instead of giving it. So they stored the driest pieces nearest the hearth, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes stacked on shelves out of reach of dripping snow or animal urine. If a visitor entered and reached for the wrong log, they were corrected instantly. Not that visitors were common in winter. No one traveled if they didn't have to. Firewood was too valuable to share. Even neighbors who helped each other with planting or threshing became cautious during the cold months. A single armful of wood could mean the difference between sleeping through the night and waking up blue-lipped. There were entire days built around firewood, gathering, cutting, stacking, checking for rot. In summer and autumn, wood was split and dried. In winter, it was guarded. If someone came in from the cold and shook the snow from their shoulders, the first glance went to the woodpile. How low it was. How fast it had shrunk since yesterday. Arguments started over firewood. When to burn it. How much to use, whose turn it was to fetch more. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about rationing survival. When to risk warmth, and when to save it. On warmer days, the fire might be allowed to die down almost entirely, leaving the room filled with breath mist and frost edging the walls, all to spare one or two precious pieces. The family shivered together, wrapped in rags and holding each other close, waiting until dusk to feed the fire again. Sometimes, when all the good wood was gone, they burned whatever they could. Broken stools, old handles, rotted beams pulled from crumbling sheds. Even then, the fire was modest, apologetic, fed by desperation. The flames flickered low, casting shadows too weak to reach the corners. But even that was better than nothing. Better than a night without light or warmth. Because once the wood was gone, there was no way to get more. The forest was far, the snow deep, the cold dangerous. You could lose fingers, or worse, just trying to collect a few damp branches. So they counted what they had left. They planned. They prayed for a thaw that never came. And still, every night, the same choice. Burn another log and sleep in warmth, or save it and hope tomorrow won't be colder. Firewood was never enough, but it was all they had, and so they guarded it like gold, burned it like memory, and survived as long as it lasted. The cold didn't knock politely. It howled. It wept. It shrieked through the seams of the house like a living thing denied its prey. The walls were not walls the way people imagined them now. Not solid, not sealed, not any true defense. They were boundaries made of crumbling stone, warped planks, and mortar that turned to powder in the damp. By midwinter, the structure itself began to tremble. You could hear it. At night, when the fire had burned low and everyone lay silent beneath their threadbare coverings, the house groaned under the weight of cold. The timbers creaked. The walls popped. Drafts snuck in and slid across the floor like rats. The wind outside wasn't just noise. It had voice. It had movement. It had intent. It pressed against the slats and groaned along the beams, seeping through the smallest holes with a high, thin wail that sounded too much like a cry to be ignored. They called it the crying cold. Not as poetry, but as warning. When the noise started, when the wind found its way into the joints of the house and began its long, slow moan, it meant the night would be a hard one. It wasn't just wind. It was something older, something emptier. It rattled door latches and lifted roof thatch like fingers testing for weakness. The walls shook gently, like a sleeper disturbed by dreams. If you placed your hand against the stone or wood, you could feel the tremor, not strong enough to bring the structure down, but enough to remind you that it wasn't safe. Nothing was. That sound got into people. It woke children from shallow sleep. It made old men sit up and stare into the dark. It made mothers hold babies closer, as if flesh could shield against sound. They knew the wind couldn't break through all at once, but it didn't have to. It only had to find the right place to whisper. Patching the walls was never enough. No matter how many rags they stuffed into the gaps, how much ash or dung or straw they pressed into the corners, something always came through. Not just air, but a presence. Cold that breathed. Cold that watched. Cold that scratched along the floorboards and pulled at the edges of blankets. They didn't speak of it during the day. It sounded foolish in the light. But at night, it was impossible to deny. Some families gave the drafts names. Not spirits, not ghosts. Just entities. The thing by the north wall. The one that whistled through the chimney hole. The one that made the floor hum. The only comfort was the fire, and even it could not hold back the cold completely. The warmth stayed close to the hearth. A few feet away, the air was sharp again, and the walls whispered in protest. Not loud, just constant, just enough to keep you listening. Sleep was a lie in such a place. You could close your eyes, but the sound of the wind in the walls would keep your mind awake, waiting for the next groan, the next shudder, the next sudden snap that meant something else had broken. It felt like the house itself was mourning, as if the cold wasn't content to freeze flesh. It wanted to unmake shelter too. Slowly, gently, piece by piece. And so they endured it, wrapped in too many layers, pressed against each other, praying without sound, waiting for dawn. Not for warmth, just for light. Because only then did the crying in the walls begin to fade, as if the cold retreated from shame. But it would come again. The next night, and the next. Until the cold got what it wanted, or ran out of time. And until then, the people inside didn't sleep. They endured, listening to the hunger in the walls and hoping they didn't become the thing it fed on. In the coldest nights, warmth was not something you had. It was something you gave. Body heat became a kind of currency, measured not in degrees or comfort, but in who needed it most and who could afford to give it. There were no heaters, no hearths that reached far enough to matter, no thick blankets to share among many. What remained was the human body, imperfect, shivering, but alive. And that alone made it valuable. The sick were given the warmest places, closer to the fire, nestled at the center of sleeping piles, wrapped in more layers than anyone else. Infants, too, were pressed against bare skin, tucked into armpits or beneath tunics, so their tiny hearts wouldn't fail before sunrise. Elders were a difficult question, too fragile to help, too necessary to lose. So their bodies were wrapped in every available cloth, and others huddled beside them, not from affection, but from necessity. Because when one person grew cold, everyone else did too. Warmth moved in the room like breath. It passed from person to person, not evenly, but deliberately. A child might be pulled into a parent's arms, not for love, but for heat. A sibling might be ordered to lie beside another, back to back, because a shared spine lost less warmth than two alone. The strongest lay on the outside of the group, their bodies buffering the rest from the chill. It wasn't fair. It wasn't cruel. It was just the way it worked. The youngest and weakest were guarded. The rest endured. There was no pride in sleeping alone. No reward for stoicism. Solitude meant exposure. Exposure meant suffering. Warmth was earned by usefulness, by vulnerability, by need. Sometimes, it was bartered in silence. A space beside the fire given in return for chores done, or a shared blanket corner granted after a favor. There were no words, only gestures, and the slow shifting of bodies toward or away from each other, according to unspoken rules. Arguments happened, not often, but enough. Someone refused to move. Someone else demanded to be closer to the fire. A blanket tugged too far in one direction could start a quiet fight in the dark. But even then, the cold always won. Anger cooled quickly when the night crept in. Grudges faded beside the need for warmth. People who resented each other by daylight still slept pressed together like siblings, limbs overlapping, breath shared between half-open mouths. They didn't have to like each other. They only had to survive. And that meant giving what warmth they had, and taking what was offered without question. It became instinct. A hand reached out in the night wasn't pushed away. It was welcomed, folded into the shared nest of limbs and cloth. Even strangers, on the rare occasion they joined the household, were brought into the huddle. There was no space for shame. A warm body was a warm body. That was all. By morning, the balance shifted again. The fire was lit. The room stirred. And the currency of heat dissolved for a few hours into movement and task. But everyone remembered who had given warmth and who had taken it. Not in bitterness, in quiet accounting. A child who had shivered all night would be watched more closely the next. A father who had coughed through the night might be moved closer to the center. It was not kindness. It was survival. Warmth could not be stored. It had to be redistributed night after night, according to who could keep it and who could not. And in that way, body heat became the economy of the household, measured not in numbers, but in bodies. In the shape they made when curled together, in the steam that rose from their breath, in the silent understanding that no one stayed warm alone. Not here, not now, not with the cold pressing in through every wall like hunger without end. Sleep was never a matter of comfort. It was a negotiation with the cold, the dark, and the smoke. And sometimes, the only way to survive the night was to stay upright. Fully lying down meant inhaling the densest layers of soot and smoke that gathered low in the room when the fire burned dirty, which it nearly always did. There was no chimney, just a small hole in the roof that might let the smoke rise, if the wind outside wasn't too strong. More often, the smoke settled in waves, layering the room from ceiling to floor. The air near the ground was thick and sour. It stung the eyes, burned the throat, filled the nose with bitterness. And so people learned to sleep sitting up, not because it was easier, but because it was safer. A head held high might find slightly clearer air. A back leaned against the wall, a neck propped on bundled cloth, a chin tucked into a shoulder. That was the closest many ever came to restful sleep. Children often curled upright in their parents' laps, cradled with their heads pressed against a chest or shoulder. Older folk leaned back on the side of the hearth, eyes half open, drifting in and out of shallow sleep, always coughing, always blinking against the haze. There was no elegance in it. Backs cramped, legs stiffened. The pressure on the spine lasted long after morning came. But if you lay flat, you might not wake up at all. The smoke was unpredictable, harmless for an hour, then thick enough to choke in seconds. People had died like that, quietly, without struggle, just gone by morning, with lungs full of soot and faces gray from the poison they breathed. So no one trusted the air close to the floor. Straw beds were reshaped into makeshift seats. Pillows were built from layers of bundled rags and firewood sacks. Even the youngest learned to sleep folded, bent at angles no body should tolerate, just to keep their mouths above the worst of it. The posture became habit. Over time, the muscles adjusted. The pain became background noise, just another part of winter. Heads drooped to one side, arms wrapped around knees. The fire's warmth never reached evenly, so people clustered close, leaning into each other, heads resting on shoulders or forearms, snoring softly despite the stiffness. The house grew quiet not because people slept well, but because they didn't have the strength to complain. A few managed to lie down, but only near windows where the smoke drifted away faster, or beside doors that leaked enough cold air to thin the fog. Those spots were cold, yes, but they allowed breathing. It was always a trade, warmth and poison, or cold and breath. Most chose the middle ground, upright, uncomfortable, half warm, half suffocating, and never fully asleep. just enough to pass the hours, just enough to wake up. By morning, the evidence of the night was everywhere. Red eyes, black mucus, soot-streaked cheeks. People cleared their throats over bowls of weak broth. Children rubbed their faces with stiff sleeves, coughing before they spoke. The air cleared slowly as the fire burned low, but the damage lingered. The house smelled of wet smoke and sour breath. But the people inside had survived again. Not well, not peacefully, but upright, aware, and breathing. That was the goal. And when the fire was stoked again that evening, when the room filled once more with gray haze and the heat settled heavy and low, they folded themselves back into the shapes that had kept them alive. Bent, propped, crooked. Because in a world where smoke could steal life silently, posture became protection. Not dignity, not rest, just another way to endure the night. They feared the silence more than the wind. The wind, loud and relentless, made the walls shake, made the thatch hum like a dying instrument. But it brought with it a strange kind of comfort. As long as the wind howled, there was movement in the air, friction in the sky, resistance in the world outside. But when it stopped, when everything suddenly fell quiet in the deep of night, when even the rafters ceased their groaning and the trees stood still like frozen shadows, that was when the cold settled in hardest. It didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with stillness. A pause in the world. No dogs barking. No wood creaking. No snow tapping against the shutters. Just that dense, heavy hush pressing down on the roof like a hand. Silence meant frost. Not frost like the sparkle on morning grass, but the deep kind, the killing kind, that seeped into bone and stayed there. People knew the pattern without understanding the science. When the wind died, the cold grew sharp. The air thickened. Breathing felt like pulling glass into your lungs. The fire, which had held its own for hours, suddenly struggled to keep warmth close. The heat it gave off seemed to vanish into the corners, absorbed by the silence itself. Straw turned brittle. Cloth stiffened. Water froze twice as fast. You could hear it, in the way the wooden beams gave small, tight cracks as their moisture fled into the void. The room darkened, not because the light had changed, but because something in the atmosphere grew heavier. Faces turned pale. Joints ached. Toes lost their sense of shape. It was the silence of winter's deepest grip, the kind that slipped past every patch, every prayer, every body pressed close. It moved through cracks that weren't there an hour ago. It breathed across skin without sound. Children sometimes asked why everything had stopped, why the world outside the walls had gone quiet. Parents never gave full answers. They only told them to lie still, to pull the blankets tighter, to keep their hands close to their bodies and not move unless they had to. Movement stirred sweat, and sweat turned cold into death. In those hours of stillness, no one reached for the door. No one checked the windows. It was too late to adjust anything. All you could do was stay where you were, buried in layers of wool and straw, listening to the stillness with dread. There were no creaks to track, no rustle of animals shifting, no hum of wind through the walls. It felt as if the earth had stopped turning, and the cold had arrived to claim what it was owed. It was a silence so complete it felt loud, like a ringing in the ears, qualms that no one could escape. And when morning finally arrived, if it arrived, it did so gently. The silence began to lift not with noise but with breath, the faint stir of limbs unfreezing, the murmur of someone rising to tend the fire, the creak of a board under careful feet. All of it sounded sharper, more real after the night's hush. And outside the world would be white, not always with snow, but with rime. Every surface glazed, every leaf crystallized. The trees, still motionless, bore the weight of it. The silence had done its work. The cold had carved itself into everything. People moved slowly, carefully, as if breaking some delicate skin that now lay over their lives. No one mentioned the stillness aloud. It didn't need to be named. They knew it would come again. Not tonight, maybe, but soon. It always did. And next time they would listen for it. Not the storm, not the howl, but the moment when all things paused, because that was when the cold truly arrived. They didn't come for food, not in the dead of winter, when even the scraps were gone. They came for warmth, driven by the same desperation that moved everything else with blood in its body. The rats crept in through holes in the walls, beneath doors that never sealed, through floorboards warped and split by frost. They came quietly, slipping across straw and rags in silence, finding the same pockets of heat that the humans clung to. Under beds, beneath blankets, in the folds of cloaks thrown over sleeping children. They didn't bite, not often. They didn't scurry in fear. They nestled, curled up beside bare feet, or into the crook of an armpit, or behind the knees out of someone too far from the fire to feel their toes. In the dark, their bodies were just more motion, more warmth. Their weight didn't surprise anyone, and no one pushed them away. They were pests in summer, but in winter, they were just another part of the cold that had learned how to survive. No one liked them. No one wanted them. But neither did anyone waste breath trying to chase them off. There was no energy to spare, no firewood to burn, just to scare away a few rodents. And besides, the rats were warm. Their bodies radiated the same slow, desperate heat as everyone else's. Children who once cried at the sight of them now whispered to them in the dark. Not names, not affection, just quiet acknowledgement. They were awake. You were awake. And the cold was worse than either of you. Mothers pulled the blankets tighter but didn't check for fur. Fathers stirred in their sleep, felt the tickle of claws against skin, and didn't open their eyes. The rats didn't steal anything. There was nothing left to steal. They just shared the space. And that unspoken truce held, because when the wind cut through the wall and the fire sputtered to its last ember, even a rat's breath could mean something. They made nests in the corners, near the hearth, under the benches where wood was stored. They chewed holes in rags already ruined by time and smoke. They crept into baskets meant for kindling and curled up there, hidden beneath twigs and soot. Sometimes you'd see the prints of their tiny feet in the frost near the door. Sometimes, in the early light, you'd find one still nestled in the crook of someone's neck, unmoving, sleeping like anything else that had survived the night. No one flinched. They were too tired, too cold, too accustomed. In the list of winter's intrusions, smoke, damp, hunger, silence, the rats ranked low. They didn't kill the fire. They didn't steal the breath. They just stayed close to it, like everything else that knew what death felt like when it walked on 2 legs or 4. When spring returned, the arrangement would end. The truce would dissolve, the brooms would come out, and the dogs would bark again, and people would curse the rats for what they were. But in the coldest months, no one said a word. they let them stay. They let them lie close, not from kindness, not from surrender, but from the raw, shared instinct to find warmth wherever it still existed. And for a few hours each night, in the darkness where even dreams couldn't keep you company, a small, foul-smelling, twitching body might press close and remind you that you were not alone in fearing the freeze. The rats came for warmth, and the people let them. Because in a house where the walls wept cold, and the blankets were thin, and the breath hung in the air like smoke, survival didn't care what shape the body took, only that it was warm, only that it stayed. The blanket was not large, it was not thick, it was not soft, it was not even whole, but it was all they had. A single frayed piece of coarse wool, patched in places where it had worn thin, stained with old soot and ash, and heavy with years of use. It wasn't enough to cover one person, let alone 5. Yet every night, the family gathered beneath it like worshippers at a shrine, silent, patient, grateful for what little warmth it offered. There was no discussion. The blanket went to the center, and the bodies arranged themselves around it. The youngest children were tucked beneath it first, their small forms folded tightly into the middle. The rest layered themselves in the spaces that remained, legs under legs, arms across shoulders, backs pressed together in a haphazard pile of limbs and breath. The blanket didn't cover everyone. It barely covered half. The rest was filled in with rags, with straw, with skin, and what wasn't covered was simply endured. They learned to move without shifting it. A single tug could leave someone else exposed, a knee uncovered, a shoulder bare to the night. So they slept still, or tried to. Waking meant noticing what was cold. Moving meant stealing heat from someone else. If the blanket slipped, no one grabbed for it. It had to be eased back slowly, quietly, with apology and care. The cloth itself was worn slick in places from this ritual. Corners rubbed smooth by fingers, edges stretched thin from being pulled too many times. It carried the scent of sweat and soot, and the faint sourness of damp straw. But to them it was familiar. It was safety. Not enough to warm the room, not enough to banish the cold, but enough to keep one part of the body from going numb. A shared warmth, a shared weight, a shared burden. They never considered getting another. Blankets didn't come easily. Cloth was expensive. Wool had to be spun, woven, bartered, begged for. A new blanket might mean giving up something else: food, shoes, medicine. And so they kept this one, year after year, season after season, mending it when it tore, scraping the soot from it when it grew too heavy, holding it up to the fire to dry it out after a night of frost. It aged with them, grew smaller in ways they couldn't explain. Children outgrew its coverage. Adults learned to give up their share without bitterness. The strongest took the edges, the places most exposed to drafts. The weakest, the sickest, the youngest. Those were buried deep in the fold. Sometimes that wasn't enough. Sometimes a child woke coughing, lips blue, breath thin, and still the blanket stayed in the middle, pulled tighter, shared thinner, clung to as though it could answer the question no one dared speak. How much longer could they keep this up? In the morning, the blanket was peeled away slowly. It clung to their bodies, stiff with cold, damp with breath. When it was lifted, the heat beneath escaped like a soul leaving flesh. The shivering returned. The silence returned. but no one complained. They folded it carefully, even reverently, and placed it near the fire to wait for night again. It wasn't warm by then. It never had time to dry completely. But it was familiar, trusted, and that counted more than anything. They never gave it a name, never praised it aloud. But the truth was understood by all. In a home where the cold reached into every crack, where the wind cried through the walls and even rats shared the bed, one blanket could mean survival. Not comfort, not rest. Just enough warmth to last until morning. And that was worth more than softness, worth more than sleep. It was worth everything, even if it only covered one at a time. They didn't close their eyes to dream. They closed them to wait. Sleep was not a gift in that house. It was a temporary escape, and even that came with conditions. You could only drift off if the fire was burning just enough, if your feet weren't too wet, if no draft had found its way through the patched wall behind your head. Even then, it wasn't sleep like the kind that brings rest. It was the kind that hovered just above awareness, broken by every sound, every shiver, every ache in the joints. They didn't chase dreams. They chased stillness. A few minutes where the cold didn't bite quite so hard, where the coughing from the corner of the room had stopped, where your breath didn't hang so thick in front of your face. That was the closest they came to peace. But dreams? No one had those. Or if they did, they never remembered them. Because each night was too much work to leave behind. The mind didn't wander when the body hurt like that. When your knees throbbed from being curled too tightly. When your spine ached from leaning against a frozen wall. When your fingers were stuffed into your armpits because gloves didn't exist anymore. The brain didn't spin stories. It counted. It listened. It worried. How much wood was left? Had the baby moved in the last hour? Was the draft getting stronger? Had someone gotten up to stir the fire? Or had the heat truly died that fast? The thoughts repeated, dull and heavy, rolling in time with the wind that hissed through the shutters. Even in sleep, they didn't let go. No dreams of summer, no memories of warmth. Just the same dull gray atmosphere, whether your eyes were open or closed. Survival didn't pause for nightfall. It only changed its rules. What had been hunger became cold. What had been movement became stillness. But the vigilance remained. Sometimes they'd wake without realizing they'd even fallen asleep. A shift in position, a groan from someone nearby, a new sound outside. Eyes snapped open, not out of fear, but out of instinct. The room never changed, still dark, still thick with smoke, still pressed down by silence that wasn't silent at all. The fire would be dimmer, the air colder, the blanket pulled farther away, a toe exposed, a shoulder uncovered. Each waking required an adjustment, not of bedding, there wasn't enough to adjust, but of the body. A leg moved closer to the center, an arm folded over a child's back, a hand tucked under a chin to stop the tremble. And then, slowly, without ceremony, sleep returned. Not because it was welcome, but because the body had no choice. It needed to power down, if only briefly, because morning would demand motion again, and there would be no strength left if the hours between were lost entirely. By the time the sun finally crawled into the house, the people inside had not rested. They had endured. Their muscles were tight, their eyes swollen, their lungs filled with the heavy, bitter residue of hours spent breathing smoke. They rose slowly, each one moving as if the cold had turned their limbs to stone. No one stretched. No one smiled. They simply began again, adding fuel to the fire, checking for frostbite, pressing fingers into numb skin to make sure it still felt like flesh. The night hadn't taken them. That was enough. There was no triumph, no relief, just the knowledge that they had made it through and that they would have to do it again tonight and again tomorrow. Because that was winter for them. Not a season, but a cycle. Not a test, but a sentence. They didn't sleep. They didn't dream. They endured, night after night, until the thaw, or until the silence finally took one of them with it. The moment came slowly, without sound, without color. A faint shift in the darkness, a lightness, not of warmth, but of pressure. The weight of night lifting just enough to notice. No birds yet, no voices. Just the air changing, as if the house had taken one long, cold breath and was finally beginning to exhale. Someone always moved first. A mother, maybe, or an old man who hadn't slept at all. They pushed aside the stiff blanket, stood with effort, and stepped across the frozen floor. Each footfall soft and deliberate, so as not to wake what little warmth clung to the others. Then the most sacred act of the day, reaching for the fire. What remained was never much. Ash, maybe a few coals, a single fragile glow. But it was enough. Enough to blow on. Enough to feed. Enough to coax back into flame. If the fire answered, if it returned, that was it. The night had not won. The house stirred slowly as the fire grew. Eyes opened without joy, but with relief. Limbs unfurled from straw and cloth. Faces emerged from under scarves and hoods. Everyone moved with the same question unspoken. Did we all make it? They checked without ceremony. A glance at the child curled in the corner. A hand over the chest of the elder. A whisper in the dark to a sleeping figure, just to hear breath. If the fire caught and no one was missing, then it was a good morning. Not a happy one, not a bright one, but a victory. Because surviving the night meant they'd been given another day to prepare for the next. Another day to mend a wall, to scavenge wood, to dry out the blanket still damp from frost. It was never celebration. It was quiet, measured, and solemn. The kind of gratitude that didn't smile but moved with purpose. The warmth spread slowly, not enough to comfort, but enough to function. Fingers thawed just enough to grip tools. Feet still ached, but they moved. No one spoke of how bad the night had been. They didn't have to. It was in their faces, their joints, the way they stared into the fire as if it held something more than flame. A kind of memory, a kind of promise. Not that everything would get better, just that they could endure one more round. The fire in the morning wasn't the same as the fire at night. At night, it was protection. In the morning, it was proof that they had endured, that the house had held, that no one had frozen in their sleep. Sometimes, someone would press a hand near the flames and whisper a single word. Nothing religious, nothing profound. Just something like good. Not because it was good, but because it wasn't worse. By midday, the fire was just fire again. Another chore, another need. But in that first hour, It was more than heat. It was hope. Real, physical, flickering in the middle of the room. They didn't dream of spring. That was too far, too abstract. But they dreamed of the next morning, of waking again, of rising to light the fire and finding that everyone else had risen too. That was enough. Hope didn't glow. It smoked. It crackled. It smelled of ash and old wood. It caught slowly and required tending. But when it caught, it changed the shape of the day. And no matter how bad the night had been, as long as that fire burned in the morning, they knew, we are still here. We are not gone. The cold didn't take us. Not yet. Not today. Each day began the same, not because of routine, but because nothing else was possible. The fire was coaxed into life with trembling hands. The same wall groaned in the same place. The straw underfoot shifted but never softened. The clothes on their backs grew more stained, more stiff, but were never changed. The sun, what little they saw of it, rose into a sky the color of metal and offered no warmth. By the time light filled the cracks in the walls, they were already moving, hauling, scraping, mending, stirring. It wasn't hope that moved them. It wasn't even fear. It was habit. The unspoken understanding that time didn't stop because they were tired. That winter would not soften just because they had. And so they moved. They did what had to be done. Not to improve anything, but to keep everything from collapsing. One more day, one more night, one more repetition of everything they already knew too well. The food didn't change. The cold didn't lessen. The same noises came from the same corner at night. The wind whining between beams. The low cough of someone whose lungs never recovered from last year's freeze. They no longer expected relief. They expected more of the same. And still, they endured it. The routine was not comforting, but it was predictable. That predictability was a kind of rope they clung to. There was no progress, no rising from poverty, no grand revelation at the end of a hard week. There was only repetition. Chop wood, carry straw, patch a hole, sit close, sleep little, wake again. The same tasks, the same aches, the same numb fingers trying to thread a needle or wrap a bandage. But it was in that sameness that they proved something, not to the world, which didn't care, but to themselves, that they could bear it, that they could take the hit and keep standing, that the world could throw the same suffering every day, and they would still answer it. It was the sameness that made them strong, not because they wanted it, but because they had no choice but to withstand it. The worst nights taught them how to survive the next. The worst hunger taught them how to stretch one crust for 3 mouths. They didn't learn resilience from change. They learned it from the lack of it, from the absence of progress, from the slow realization that enduring wasn't a temporary act, but a permanent condition. And yet they stayed. They didn't run. There was nowhere to run. They didn't scream, no one would hear. They didn't cry often, because frozen tears burned the skin. They just did what had to be done, again and again. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't noble. It was just what survival looked like when stripped of drama. A repetition so dull, so hard, so endless, that most would break just from the monotony of it. But they didn't break, not completely, not yet. Nothing changed. But neither did they fall. The walls held barely. The bodies warmed eventually. The food ran out, but something always showed up to replace it. Roots, broth, bark, hope. And when they lay down each night in the same place, under the same fabric, next to the same breathless quiet, they did so with no illusions. Tomorrow would not be different, but they would still be here, still enduring, still rising in the dark to find the embers, still passing heat from body to body, still listening to the same wind say the same things through the same holes in the roof. They weren't waiting for spring. They weren't waiting for anything. They were surviving. And for those born into this life, that was enough. It had to be. Because in the repetition, in the gray sameness, in the frozen hours that never stopped coming, they proved the one thing the cold couldn't take, that they could take it, again and again and again. Thanks for staying with us tonight. What you've just heard wasn't a story of adventure or glory. It was something quieter, heavier, and far more real. It was a glimpse into the cold, breath-stealing nights that medieval peasants survived not with strength, but with endurance. There were no miracles, no comfort, no finish line, only repetition. And somehow, in that repetition, they endured. Not because they hoped for more, but because they learned to survive with less. As you drift off, remember, history isn't made only in castles or on battlefields. Sometimes it's made in silence, by ordinary people, huddled together in the dark, doing what it takes to wake up one more time. Sleep well. Let the noise of the modern world fade for a while. You're warm, you're safe, and the night holds no danger for you now.